Well, good morning, everybody. I'm very honored to welcome you as Sweden's ambassador to the United States, to the House of Sweden this morning. Really pleased to be here. Our embassy is co-hosting this event with the Migration Policy Institute, and we're very happy and proud to do that. And we have three very special guests here at the podium, and I'd like to start off by introducing them all to you. Lars Westbratt, State Secretary to Sweden's Minister for Justice and Migration. You have a particular responsibility for migration issues, and you have been critical to Sweden's effort in dealing with the migration crisis affecting Sweden and Europe over the past year and a half. I think we'll hear more about that in just a minute, and of course you also had a very important role in formulating the policy and the work on the implementation of that policy when it comes to Sweden's global migration policy. You came to Washington, D.C. yesterday, and you have a number of meetings over the next couple of days with the administration, with IFIS and think tanks and other organizations. And of course, we very much look forward to your assessment and insights at this seminar. Turn to Simon Hershaw from the State Department, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary, Bureau of Population, Refugee and Migrations. You have a very solid experience from the Foreign Service, having held numerous posts abroad, not least in the Western Hemisphere, and we are very pleased to have you here as well, Simon. And last, but certainly not least, very happy to welcome Kathleen Newland. I don't think, Kathleen, that you require an introduction to those who work on migration issues. You are sort of a rock star of the business. And in addition to that, you are also the co-founder of the Migration Policy Institute and a senior fellow there. And we are delighted, Kathleen, that you have agreed to provide us with your insights and also to be moderating this session today. Now, before I hand over the floor to our three guests, I'd just like to get and give you a little bit of a context to the discussion. Not only in Sweden, but in large parts of the world, also here in the U.S., the migration crisis has no doubt dominated the agenda of the last year. And in Sweden, it has partly also pushed out other issues. This is due, of course, to the fact that Sweden last year received an unprecedented number of asylum seekers, more than 160,000, resulting in an almost 2% increase of the Swedish population. If you would speak about it in U.S. terms, it would be about 6 million people in 1 year. And you could understand that this, of course, have put a lot of stress on the Swedish system. Now, Sweden has a tradition of welcoming refugees and migrants, and being one of the major humanitarian actors in the world, we are also actively trying to find solutions to the situation at hand. Global responsibility, burden sharing, and solidarity is, of course, key in doing this. And in addition, for what we try to do in Sweden and within the European Union, we also want to use the upcoming international meetings on refugees and migrants. I think Simon might be addressing these further. Try to use these meetings to move the agenda forward. Sweden and the United States are very close partners on this, and Sweden is, of course, honored to be co-hosting the Leaders' Summit on Refugees with President Obama in New York in September. With those few words, actually I'd like to hand over to Kathleen to kick off what I'm confident is going to be a very interesting and important discussion this morning. Let me just add, please follow the conversation and take part in it also online at Sweden in USA, hashtag migration, hashtag refugee crisis, hashtag migration chat. You can choose or add them all to your tweets and be part of the conversation, which will continue also after today's meeting. Welcome all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Löfvel, for that more than kind introduction. And let me say what a pleasure it is to be collaborating yet again with the Embassy of Sweden. We've had such a productive and pleasant partnership with the embassy over the years, and to be in this spectacular venue enhances any discussion that one might have on migration. Thank you all for coming. As you know, I'm Kathleen Newland from the Migration Policy Institute, and we, as I said, have had a strong partnership with Sweden, not only with the embassy, but with the Ministry of Justice, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's a particular pleasure to welcome Eva Ackerman-Borge, a longtime quiet power behind the global migration discussion, who has really played a tremendous role in moving it forward, and has been a force of continuity through changes of personnel, changes of government. And we really feel extremely privileged today to welcome Lars Vestbrat, the State Secretary to the Swedish Minister for Justice and Migration. And we've collaborated with Lars through our MPI's office in Brussels, and it's wonderful to see him in Washington. I hope that none of you will feel that we have been guilty of false advertising in billing this session as sort of how to fix global migration management. I don't think any of us have a magic formula to fix migration management, but we can perhaps clarify what needs fixing and why. We can perhaps identify some elements that might be fixed and look at some ways of pushing those into practice. There's at least one reason to feel somewhat optimistic on this score. Never before in my lifetime and in my shockingly long career in migration, at least I hope you would find it shocking, but never before have I seen politicians and policymakers so focused on the issues surrounding international migration. This, of course, is closely linked to the arrival in Europe of tremendous numbers of migrants in the last year, 18 months. It's closely linked to the Syria crisis and to the continuing series of appalling tragedies in the Mediterranean. These events and processes have really seized the attention of the people who can go some distance toward fixing global migration management. And I sincerely hope that this year of summits and high-level meetings will have a productive outcome, will have an outcome that will make a real difference for migrants and for the countries that host them and the countries that may, in the long term, benefit from the dispersal of their population to other countries and form close international ties across borders. So we are going to start with Secretary of State Lars Vestbrat. We're then very, very pleased to have Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Simon Henshaw from the U.S. State Department's Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, who is deeply involved in this year's processes and has a long and extremely subtle and nuanced grasp of these issues. So Simon, thank you for joining us as well. I will then come back for a few comments after our two guests have spoken. Lars, please, and thank you.
Well, thank you everyone for coming here today. This is actually my first time in America, believe it or not, and it's very pleasant to be here in Washington, and I'm very honored that you are all coming here. So let me start by thanking the Migration Policy Institute and the Swedish Embassy here in Washington for organizing this event. I'm very glad for the opportunity to speak about the global refugee and migration situation. And let me also thank Simon Henshaw from the State Department for coming here today to this seminar. But first of all, I want to express my deepest sympathy to all the relatives and to the American people for the terrible deeds that took place in Orlando a few days ago. So, ladies and gentlemen, throughout history, people have moved between countries, regions, and continents, both for longer and shorter periods of time, in search for new opportunities and a better life for themselves and for their families. Migration is a driver of human progress. If managed well, it contributes to development and reduces poverty. We need to ensure that migrants migrate out of choice and not out of necessity. As you all know, we live in a world where conflicts, violence, persecution, and human rights violations have forced an unprecedented number of people to leave their homes, including many millions of refugees. In addition, the resilience of the entire countries and communities is increasingly challenged by natural disasters and climate change. As we now approach the 19th September UN high-level meeting and President Obama's Leaders Summit on the refugees on the 20th of September, the need for a more even global sharing of responsibilities is clear. More countries have to take a greater share. This responsibility could be shouldered in different ways. One example is providing secure and legal options, such as resettlement for people in need of international protection. Responsibility sharing can also be expressed through humanitarian assistance as well as long-term development cooperation in host and neighboring countries. With a refugee situation unique in scope and a record number of migrants, it is more important than ever to safeguard the international conventions and agreements and ensure respect for the right to seek asylum. Recognition of the vulnerable situation and risks facing migrants is vital. Children who are unaccompanied or separated from the families are especially vulnerable. In our view, the shortcomings of the international system depends first and foremost on the lack of implementation and coordination, and not on the absence of norms, obligations, or institutions. Against this background, Sweden welcomes and supports the Migrants in Countries in Crisis initiative. We would like to thank the governments of the United States and Philippines for taking this initiative and IOM for serving as a secretariat. These practical guidelines, formulated after a broad, state-led and consultative approach, can play a central role in increasing the implementation of existing norms and making the responsibilities of the different stakeholders clearer. We all bring different perspectives and experiences to the global discussion on the refugees and migrants. Sweden is approaching the global dialogue as a major humanitarian and development donor. We are a country that received 160,000 asylum seekers last year, a number twice as high as the year before. And of the total number of asylum seekers last year, 35,000 were accompanied minors. It means a great challenge for Sweden with a population of 10 million people. But it also should not prevent us from pursuing new initiatives on the humanitarian areas. For example, our commitment to resettlement. We are gradually increasing our resettlement quota from the current level of 1,900 people a year to 5,000 people by the end of 2018. Another example is our new regional development strategy for the Syria crisis. The aim is to strengthen the resilience of the Syrian population and of vulnerable groups in Syria's neighboring countries. The strategy focused on improved livelihood opportunities and access to basic public services such as healthcare and education. I would now like to shift the attention back to the issue of well-managed migration and the importance of creating conditions for the people who choose to migrate, to do so in safe, orderly and regulated manner. In this area, global responsibility sharing can be manifested in strengthened cooperation and partnerships between countries of origin, transit and destination, but also with international organizations and civil society. As mentioned, migration is a driver of human progress and development. Migration does not only contribute to development through the hundreds of billions of dollars remitted each year. Migration also contributes to filling needs on the labor market, encouraging trade and investments, as well as transferring skills and ideas between urban and rural areas and between countries. The central issue is how we ensure that these development effects are harnessed for the benefits of all countries of origin, countries of destination, and the migrants and their families. With the inclusion of migration in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, we have created a framework that can assist us in meeting the challenges ahead and help us foster the positive effects of migration and development. Take labor migration as an example. Labor migration offers opportunities for economical development and acquisitions of knowledge and skills. However, this is only possible if the migrants receive fair terms of employment, including equal pay. We need to focus on the empowerment of migrants. Here it is important to keep in mind that around half of the migrants are women. Their contribution to development and their particular needs has only been acknowledged in recent years. And this is an area we need to pay more attention to. Prevention of labor exploitation and discrimination of migrants is central, both nationally and globally. This is an issue the Swedish government takes very seriously. Sweden has, since the beginning of the Global Forum for Migration and Development, had a strong commitment to this process, which has succeeded in creating greater trust between countries and creating partnerships in this area. We are also one of 4 co-chairs of the group of Friends of Migration in New York that was created as a platform for constructive, cross-regional and open discussions on issues relating to migration in the run-up to the 19th September meeting and beyond. In closing, I would like to make one last point on the issue of global governance. We believe that the time has come for IOM as a leading global organization for migration to become a part of the UN system. Today's realities required increased global cooperation and coordination in the area of human mobility. We believe that an inclusion of IOM in the UN system in the longer run can contribute to such an improvement. IOM, with its expertise and knowledge, has, for example, a crucial role to play in the implementation of the migrant-related targets in the 2030 Agenda. Thank you much for your attention. Thank you.
Introduce you further.
Good morning. Let me just start by thanking the ambassador and the Swedish Embassy for hosting and for MPI's role here. It's a terrific organization, one we very much enjoy working with, though I do have to say that I rarely hear my name and the word subtle in the same sentence. I enjoyed that. Have to tell that to my wife tonight. Very much appreciate the attendance of the State Secretary. I hadn't realized it was your first time here. I would have bored you with some history of Washington. Maybe after this. No, it's a beautiful building, too. It's so fitting that we are in Sweden's embassy this morning, given Sweden's role as a global humanitarian leader. The United States and Sweden have long worked together to support and advance humanitarian principles and human migration management practices, and we will continue to do so. This morning I'd like to focus on a modest piece of the question, the huge question, of how to fix the global migration management system by sharing some of the United States' views on what we can realistically accomplish in the two important UN meetings coming up in September. The President of the General Assembly's high-level meeting on large movements of refugees and migrants, and the Leaders' Summit that President Obama is co-hosting with governments who have made new and significant contributions towards refugee assistance. But I do, again, want to emphasize how well the U.S. and Sweden work together on international migration, as we do on a wide range of topics. The U.S. and Sweden often share the same positions on migration issues in that we welcome new immigrants, we respect the human rights of all migrants regardless of status, we see refugees and migrants as great contributors to our societies, and we see migration as contributing to development of both migrants' home countries and host societies. One reason for our strong alliance on these issues perhaps is grounded in our interwoven migration histories, as Swedish immigrants have played a big part in the history and making of America. From 1850 to 1930, more than 1 million Swedes immigrated to the U.S., one of the highest rates of emigration of all European nations during that time period. The U.S., then a young country, needed all those people. We're not as young as we were then, but we're still able to absorb large numbers of migrants. We take in more refugees and immigrants than any country in the world, and we still need them. Immigrants are 30% more likely to start a business in the United States than non-immigrants, and 18% of all small business owners in the United States are immigrants. Immigrant-owned businesses create jobs for American workers. And now Europe needs immigrants too. As the population ages, many countries in Europe are experiencing declines in population and human resources. Migrants and refugees, like in the U.S., can make great contributions to European societies. I know the sheer numbers arriving in a short period have been overwhelming, and integrating large populations from different cultural and language backgrounds takes a lot of resources. But as a global community, we need to ask ourselves, how can we better manage the large number of refugees and migrants who are on the move? In the case of the current wave of refugees and migrants moving to Europe, we ought to not just respond, but we should also use the occasion as a time for education, for a fresh look, to redesign if needed, and to challenge ourselves to do more. To quote IOM Director General Bill Swing, "Migration is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be managed." I love that phrase. Not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be managed. I think I can safely say that Sweden and the United States are both committed to working with other countries, international organizations, civil society, refugees, and migrants to do more. In fact, we are very pleased that Sweden will co-host with President Obama the Leaders' Summit on Refugees on September 20th. We hope this event will encourage new commitments for increasing funding of humanitarian appeals, resettling refugees, and creating other legal pathways for admission and improving education and employment access for refugees. Another important event is being hosted by the President of the General Assembly. In safety and in dignity, addressing large movements of refugees and migrants. will seek to reaffirm the Refugee Convention and the principle of responsibility sharing while looking for innovative and cooperative approaches to meeting the needs of refugees and migrants in the long term. In our view, the PGA High Level should work to inspire new ways of thinking on addressing migrant issues, such as how to address vulnerable migrants that don't meet the legal definition of a refugee, or how to help those returned to their countries of origin. We hope the event will lead to concrete efforts that strengthen protection of vulnerable migrants and trafficking victims and improve international coordination and cooperation on migration management among states, international organizations, civil society, and the private sector at all levels, with an aim towards improving migration management and maximizing the benefits of migration around the globe. We must especially work to ensure that those trafficking victims, children, and other vulnerable migrants who are not refugees get appropriate protection and assistance. In this respect, we would support a state-led process to develop guidelines for working with migrants in vulnerable situations. While we hope the PGA event will look with a fresh eye at what global responsibility sharing and international cooperation for refugees and migrants really mean, we also don't want to reinvent the wheel. We should look largely to existing international and regional forums like the Global Forum on Migration and Development and the many regional consultative processes that link countries up by regions and mutual interests, such as realizing the benefits of migration or addressing smuggling and trafficking. In looking at how to improve responses, the PGA event should also take stock of recent initiatives currently underway to improve responses to vulnerable migrants, refugees, and other displaced populations. The Special Representative to the UN Secretary General on International Migration, Peter Sutherland, has highlighted the work of governments through many multilateral initiatives where interested states come together for collective action to address specific migration issues, such as the Nansen Initiative, that addresses those displaced in the context of natural disasters, including the adverse effects of climate change, and the Migrants in Countries in Crisis Initiative, known as MICIC, led by the UN launching of the guidelines that resulted from this initiative. This is the outcome of an effort of which we are very proud. It was state-led and inclusive of all stakeholders, including civil society, the private sector, migrant and diaspora organizations, and focused on practical ways to help and protect migrants. We hope this process serves as a strong example for future efforts to improve protection in a broader array of situations for vulnerable migrants. We think MICIT will be a concrete contribution to the upcoming UNGA PGA event. It might even be a model for state-led process to develop a broader set of guidelines for the treatment of vulnerable migrants. Of course, the fruit of this initiative will only be seen when governments actually apply the guidelines to working with migrants and their own citizens who migrate throughout the world. There is no doubt that the sheer number and needs of those fleeing to Europe have put tremendous pressure on governments, humanitarian and political structures. But the spotlight on what is happening has also helped us face a new reality. We need humane migration systems that take into account today's realities. Migration is inevitable, and we need to stop discussing ways to end it and talk more about how to benefit from it. In doing so, we take an important first step towards the essential work of updating our systems. We hope the PGA event in September will rally countries to take concrete actions to strengthen international cooperation, to prevent more loss of life on the migration routes, and to improve conditions for refugees and migrants and develop migration responses. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, both Lars and Simon, for those really sort of inspiring, hopeful, forward-looking addresses. I want to just take a few minutes now to talk about some of the sort of pathways and get down to specifics about what might happen now as a result of these summits, as a result of the sort of intensive political discussions that have been taking place over the last year and more. This really has been the year of the summits and the high-level meetings, starting in March with a special session at UNHCR focused on Syrian refugees, a pledging conference, continuing with the Valletta conference between the EU and African countries of origin, and through an intensive process of preparatory meetings for the summits in September. I have to say that so far the results have been rather disappointing. And so I think that puts even more pressure on those who are investing in the September summits. There is obviously, when we talk about how to fix the global migration system, there is the big project of addressing the root causes of migration. That's intuitive. I think we all understand it, though perhaps not in such a granular way as we might. It is, for example, very often said that, in order to make migration more manageable, we need more development, economic development, whereas, in fact, the evidence shows that up to a certain point, more development produces more migration. More people can afford to migrate. More people have access to the information and the connections that allow them to think that they might succeed in migrating. So there are not many simple sort of linear relationships around migration. But nonetheless, development over time is part of the answer. And addressing the root causes, which, as we know, include the obvious things: violence, poverty, corruption, inequality, exclusion. And I think perhaps tying all of those things up into a sort of bundle, the loss of hope, when people feel that there is no hope that their situation will improve in their home countries, migration is one of the options that many people consider. So we have this package of sustainable development goals, which are addressing some of these root causes, and it's a big long-term project. We can't expect to see results overnight. So what to do in the meantime? I think that, particularly when you look at the long-term cycle of migration and the benefits of migration that both Lars and Simon talked about, the mismatch between that and electoral cycles, the mismatch between that and sort of waves of popular sentiment create a dilemma. So I think there are two things that need to be done in the meantime. One of them is working with what we have, making existing systems work better. And the second is to innovate. And I think of innovation in sort of an accumulation of a lot of relatively small bore initiatives that could really together help migrants feel more secure, help migrants be more secure in their journeys. When I talk about working with what we have, I'm thinking, for example, of the global system of consular services and consular protection. Pretty much every country has consulates, which are there to not only to promote the interests of the country and its citizens, but also to protect them and to provide services. But so many small or poor or developing countries or countries with widely dispersed migrant and diaspora populations just don't have the capacity to provide a full array of consular services to their citizens. And I think if the international system, international institutions, other countries could help those nations to strengthen and broaden their consular services, that it would certainly be a contribution to a more secure and productive status for people who are living or even traveling outside their home countries. There's been a lot of accomplishments in the field of safe passage for migrants, but I think we're all still aware of the tremendous dangers that people run when they are migrating, particularly migrating without prior authorization. The death rate in the Mediterranean is the one that is most visible to us in the West, although there are also many other extremely dangerous routes and deaths that we never hear about in the Sahara, in the Bay of Bengal, in other regions. If you just look at the contrast now between the central Mediterranean route between Libya and Italy, and contrast that with the sort of much shorter and less difficult passage between Turkey and Greece, there have still been deaths, and certainly far too many deaths, in the Aegean between Turkey and Greece. But the rate, compared to the number of people who have made that crossing, is really very small and much smaller than it used to be, because there's a whole array of naval resources from NATO countries, from EU countries in the region providing rescue services. They're there in the central Mediterranean as well, but it's a much broader area and it's been a less intensive process. And that is an area where some real progress could be made. Of course, the other part of that is trying to address more effectively the smuggling industry that puts people at such dire risk. A third thing where we can work with what we have and try to make the systems work better is in the area of legal pathways for migrants, so that they don't have to take the risks. I look at the United States with 11 million people without legal status, many of whom, probably the majority of whom, have been here for 5 or 10 years, who have citizen children born in the United States, and who are working and contributing to our economy. And I think, it's a scandal that with that many equities and that many contributions, there is almost no legal pathway for those migrants. So I think that one of the things that countries who, as Simon pointed out, need labor, need low-skilled labor, or what we refer to as low-skilled labor, although Eva and I were talking about earlier before this about the difficulties involved in milking a cow, which is normally thought of as low-skilled labor. I'm not so sure. So countries that need low-wage labor, perhaps, need to institute legal ways for that labor to be provided. And that is just, I think, a moral as well as a practical responsibility. So look at what we have and see how those instruments can be expanded and can work better for more people. That's not going to do the whole job. I think we also need to think about innovations, and I think that's one of the things that this conference process has drawn forth a lot of thinking about new ways to manage international migration. And ideas that sometimes have sort of technical solutions but need the political backing include things like having a universal system of secure identification documents for migrants, regardless of their legal status as migrants, but a way of proving who you are, and perhaps as importantly these days, proving who you're not. If it's attached to your own iris or your own fingerprints or your own face, I think it's people have a right to a secure identity, and it seems that it's not beyond the capacity of states to come up with an agreed way of recognizing that. We need to lower the costs of remittances and the costs of recruitment, which can keep migrants in debt bondage throughout their working career with with extremely high interest rates and exploitative loans for travel. So there are, I think Simon mentioned the word mini multilateralism, which I think is a much more engaging term than coalition of the willing, where it doesn't take universal agreement among the 200 odd countries in the world to make real progress on some of these things. Migration affects all countries, but it doesn't affect all countries equally. So the top 10 countries of migrant destination in the world host half of the world's migrants. You know, if we could solve some of these problems for half of the world's migrants, if those top 10 countries could agree on certain ways forward, that would make a huge difference. The G20 countries host 55%. 20% of international migrants are in the U.S. alone. Building coalitions among the sort of critical mass of countries, I think, is something that is perhaps a more realistic aspiration than a universal compact on global migration or a universal compact on refugees. Not that that would be a bad idea. I think it's a good idea. But in terms of getting things done practically on the ground, mini multilateralism, that wonderful term coined by a former colleague of mine at the Carnegie Endowment, Moises Naim, gives you a different way of looking at how to make real progress on the ground. Just the third thing I want to mention is partnerships. And of course, we've heard a great deal about responsibility sharing for refugees and the need for states to come together and share the responsibility for protecting refugees, for protecting migrants also, protecting the human rights of migrants. And that is critically important, but it's not just about states. You know, states think that they are the actors in migration management. But when you look at who the real actors are, in addition to states, first, of course, it's migrants themselves. They're the ones who make the decision to get up and go. But it's also their employers, the private sector. It's often philanthropic institutions who provide services that states fall short on. It's the international institutions. In some countries, it's religious organizations, NGOs, diasporas, and very importantly, local authorities. Integration happens on the ground. It happens in cities and towns and rural communities. And the authorities and the civil society organizations at that level tend to get left out of this great sort of global discussion. We need to bring them in. So let me conclude by expressing hope for the summits, that they will not only articulate the universal human rights, the values that migrants bring to both countries of origin and countries of destination, but also for some concrete initiatives like the Migration in Countries in Crisis initiative, a great example of, as Simon said, of mini multilateralism, of a few countries coming together and really pushing this idea forward. And to do what can practically be done. I think there is a lot. Samuel Gompert, the great labor leader in the heyday of the U.S. labor movement, was once asked by an opposite negotiator, "Mr. Gompert, what do you want?" And he said, "More." And that's what I want from these summits, is more. Thank you very much. So we are now going to turn to the discussion period, which I'm very much looking forward to, and I know that Lars and Simon are as well. This session is being recorded, so please wait for a microphone to come to you if you have a comment or a question. I will try to keep a list, and please let me know if you would like to. Peggy, and then Luca.
Thank you very much. I'm Peggy Orchowski. I'm the congressional correspondent for the Hispanic Outlook, and I've been writing about immigration, mainly on the aspect of evolving immigration laws. So my question involves that side. You all are representing the global challenge in the international organizations, and I write about the nation states' response. And that seems to me what's missing in almost all your comments, because the biggest problem is that a lot of citizens in the nation states don't want more migrants, or they want a limited number, or they want controlled. And everything you've been saying is more migrants, more. And so how do you address this very political problem of that large numbers of people in all the countries now, we're seeing in all the top 10 countries, there is a resistance to more. And there is a demand for a guarantee of enforcement when you have migrants who come in that don't qualify as refugees. How do you deport them? How do you intend to enforce them? I mean, that's part of this picture too.
Thank you. Thank you, Peggy. We'll have a comment from Lars, and then Simon might have something to say on that myself.
Well, this is a difficult question, because from the Europe perspective, we know that we try to pursue many countries, many member states in Europe to get along with taking the responsibility in the refugee crisis. But it's also shown that it's very, very, very hard to do that. And I don't have the answer in this question, but I believe that we can be certain, everyone, that migration, well-managed migration, lead to progress for everyone, for the migrants and for the country they come to, as well as we know that bad managed migration leads to fear, and then they became afraid of taking migrants. So we have to show the positive side of migration, but that's not the whole answer. I also believe that we must push them forward to take the global responsibility, and this is one of the things I hope that the Obama summit meeting maybe can lead to. Make more countries do their share in this way, and maybe we also should know the facts about migration. As Simon said, migration will not stop. It must be managed. Migration will always be there. People have always migrated and will always do it. And if you can see the future, you can see that the population in Africa are increasing very much, and you can see the environmental migration also tends to increase all the time. So how can we manage the future in a way that the future will be? Yeah.
It's a very broad question and difficult to answer. We live in a world of sovereign states, and sovereignty means that all power rests with the states. So it's a question of cajoling, negotiating, working with other states. Look at us ourselves. We've failed in our attempts to reform our own immigration policies. So, and that's based on a lot of fear of what migrants are, instead of dealing with the problem that actually exists. I don't think we have I don't think we have a difficult time in working with our European partners. Well, okay, two branches here. One is changing laws to get more legal entry. Very hard, needs to be done. But the other is equal and, well, good and fair treatment of migrants. And we don't have any problems working with our European partners, talking about how we can all better work together to treat migrants better and look for systems to treat them humanely even when they're returned. I don't think that's a difficult area. And finally, I just wanted to say it's important to remember that most migrants are not south-north, certainly not most refugees. 85% or something like that, 85% of refugees are in countries that are middle income or poor. So there's a lot that can be done working with those countries and trying to improve the lives of refugees and migrants. I spend a lot of my time working in those areas, working with these countries in trying to change the rules and regulations on how refugees are treated in their country. And we've had quite a lot of success in some areas there. So I think there's a lot that can be done there with both money and humanitarian diplomacy.
Just quickly, Peggy, I think it is important to acknowledge that migration is a disruptor. And, you know, like the adoption of new technologies, like changing gender roles, it leaves some people feeling relatively deprived or relatively uncomfortable with a new arrangement. And, you know, in simple terms, it produces winners and losers. And I think we need to address the fears that people have, counter those fears where they can be, you know, truthfully countered, although it's very difficult to fight emotion with fact, as I've discovered. So we have to also deploy the emotional arguments and point out that the benefits that migration brings to communities and to people, while still acknowledging that not everyone benefits and not everyone benefits equally. I think we need to work much harder on integration, and I have to say I think that's particularly true in Europe, you know. And I think we also have to really acknowledge the role of political opportunism in this debate. I do not by any means believe, and polls show, that anti-immigration sentiment is not the majority in most countries, but it makes a lot more noise. And so I think it's incumbent to try to counter that. I have a longish list already. Let me just tell you who I have on that list so you can raise your hand if you're not on it. I have Luca. I have a gentleman on the black, in a dark shirt on the aisle there, whose name I don't know, I apologize. I have Shelley Pitterman at the back, Suzanne Sheldon, and a lady in a blue scarf in the middle over here. So Luca, let's start, and we'll have to be relatively brief in our responses if we want to get to
Thank
all
you,
of these
and
and more.
Luca Dall'Olio, IOM representative in Washington, D.C. Thank you to MPI, the Embassy of Sweden, for this very timely meeting. Yesterday I was in New York, and indeed the MIKIK initiative shows that when a state-led initiative is open and inclusive of civil society, international organizations, the private sector, there is a broad ownership. And now that the guidelines are out, I hope this process will be continued in its implementation. It cannot remain a book on the shelf, but will indeed address at the field level, with the cooperation of a broad, this kind of ownership as stakeholders really go into the direction that you, sir, have indicated, for instance, with the consular network, for instance. But my question is more on the fixing issue. You have been you mentioned that it's been disappointing to see that the initiatives so far have not really brought important results. Perhaps one area where we have made some progress is in the humanitarian field. In the World Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul, we have seen if you like, the participation of the developmental actors in having a road path to participate in addressing protracted crises. The World Bank now seems to become very engaged in this area. This may indeed bring some results in the first asylum countries, for instance, in the Syria crisis. But it also shows that we can address the humanitarian dimension, we can address the developmental dimension, the partnership dimension, but there is another dimension where perhaps we have not given the same level of attention, which is the security issues. the Security Council unable to intervene, other mechanisms not being able to modify situations such as the Central Mediterranean route. I mean, as long as the Libya crisis remains as it is, it will certainly be very difficult to operate, to dismantle those networks or criminal networks in terms of smuggling, trafficking of migrants, and so on. So perhaps this is one of the elements that has remained outside the equation and needs more attention in the future. Thank you.
Excellent points, Luca. Would either of you like to respond to that, or should we just say yes? Yes. Excellent points. Thank you. Yes, please. Could you introduce yourself?
My name is Seth Konowitz. Just a quick question for the Swedish representative. Just wondering what you see as the future to the Skagen zone in view of the new reality that you're discussing related to the mass migration and the number of asylum seekers going into Sweden at this point.
Yes, the situation in Europe has put a strain on the Europe and the Schengen cooperation. Of course, when several member states put in border control, the Schengen will risk not to exist anymore, and the free movement when it concerns people and mercenaries and everything, there is a big risk that this will stop, and the economical problem which comes up with border control in the area of EU. I believe it's crucial to have strengthened border control around Europe, to be able to have an open Europe inside. And that's why it's so important to have these decisions from the European Commission now to strengthen the border control around the EU. And of course, it's always difficult when you see the situation around Europe with all the refugees. Hopefully, the statement between EU and Turkey will continue to work, and we can have some kind of way to deal with the big problem we have in the EU, to have a more to share the responsibility more, but also to handle the migrants in outside of the EU.
Thank you, Lars. Next on my list is Shelley Pitterman.
Hello, good morning. My name is Shelley Pitterman. I'm the representative for UNHCR here in Washington. I also want to echo Luca's appreciation for this convening, and also say thank you to Sweden, and also, of course, to the U.S. for everything that you're doing for refugees and migrants. The gentleman before me asked the question that I wanted to ask, which was perhaps a little bit more focused on how Sweden sees the future, given the ruptures within the European Union and the very strong positions that some states have taken. Poland, Hungary, we can name others where there's more barbed wire, there are more barriers to movement. How you see that evolving, since in the same spirit of mini multilateralism, we can only solve the problem globally by addressing the problems regionally and within countries. So how do you see that evolving? And if you feel that you've already answered that question, then let me just ask furthermore, where do you see the engagement, since most refugee movements and a lot of migration is south-south, how do you see the commitment of southern states in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East in particular to addressing this? Since Asia is not a co-chair of the Leader Summit, and there hasn't been that much, well, there are new signals, if you take Kenya, for example, of growing, of a contagion effect almost from Europe and the EU-Turkey agreement. How do you see that evolving against this hopeful spirit for the forthcoming summits?
When it comes to the first question, I just want to add to what I said before, that I believe it's a worrying development when it comes to certain countries in Europe, not mentioning any names now, but where you can see a nationalistic tone coming out stronger and stronger, and this is very worrying. We have seen even in Sweden, we have parties then, that have grown very much the recent years. So we must fight this development in all ways, in Sweden and in Europe and in other parts of the world. When it comes to work with countries outside EU, I believe it's crucial that we strengthen the partnership between EU and countries in Africa and in the Asia and Middle East, to have a better cooperation and a good dialogue between these countries. We can't solve or manage, more likely, this situation ourselves, and this problem we can see. And sometimes it's maybe not a problem. It's a way to react towards the fact that the world looks like this. But better cooperation and deeper cooperation, and I believe that EU now takes this ball and try to spin it in a dialogues with other countries. And that's also what the summits now here in U.S. are heading against. Better dialogue with other countries.
Simon, do you want to add anything on that?
Just very quickly on the second part of the question, it's so important that you raise South-South movements, because I think we, have a tendency in the North to think that everyone's trying to move here, and the numbers just don't show that. We need to do a lot more work. I think the reality is not even. There are countries that are doing great things. Look at Turkey and Lebanon and Jordan, all the sacrifices they're making to support Syrians. Though we encourage them to do more in areas of employment and education. Countries like Uganda, which have long served as refuge for people from around the region, so from around their region. So countries doing really well, and other countries, which I'm not going to list here, not doing as well. And I think we have to spend more time working with them, more time giving them resources, and more time working with them to make sure that their laws and regulations are more refugee and migrant friendly. And I'm hoping that the conferences this fall lead to some movements in that direction.
Yeah, I just point out on that as others have, that providing protection to refugees and to other vulnerable migrants is a sort of global public good, and it has a price tag. And we've just sort of expected, we provide lots and lots of humanitarian assistance, particularly Sweden and the U.S. and a few others. But it certainly doesn't cover the costs to the hosting countries of what they and their people and their communities put into this. Now, I think the EU-Turkey statement has sort of put a price tag on that. And it will be interesting to see. I think we're already beginning to see other countries saying, well, we should be getting paid. If you want us to stop migrants from getting to Europe, whether by being attractive to them or by erecting barriers, we have a price tag too. And I think that may, it's too early to say how that's going to play out, but it could have good aspects and bad aspects. I think the EU has now established a $60 billion fund for just that kind of cooperation. It's not clear where the money is going to come from, But I think there is a recognition that that kind of cooperation has a price tag. Suzanne. And could you introduce yourself for those who don't know you,
Yes,
if there are any?
Is this on? I have
Yes,
a good loud
it's
voice. So
voice activated.
I want to go back to Peggy's really excellent question, which I think really is one of the absolute core questions of the day. When what we in this room are saying conflicts with what the public says it wants, what do we do? And there were 3 excellent answers to that I'll just briefly elaborate on. And that is that I think it's incumbent on leaders to both do something and say something. Lars touched on the important question of what do leaders do. What leaders do is they have to manage it. If there's simply hand-wringing, which we have seen in some of the crises, the public won't have confidence and won't want migrants and won't see any benefits. We've seen when large boats come with large numbers of people on our own southern border, when masses of unaccompanied children came in the last couple of years, which I'm sure you covered, it's frightening to people. Not that the children themselves were frightening, but people coming in masses feels like an invasion to some people. It's not an invasion. Leaders have to convey that. They have to show that they can manage it well, and that alone will inspire some confidence. Then they have to say something, and what they have to say is convey some facts. Although I think Kathleen made the very good point that it's very hard to overcome emotion. Last night, some of us were talking about this, and there are some very interesting studies. The German Marshall Foundation does these studies in Europe and the U.S. that ask people, polls that ask people, what percent of the citizenry in your country do you think are foreign-born? And people in many countries inevitably inflate that number to an incredible degree. Where the real number might be 5%, people will say 35%, particularly in countries where there might be some problems with integration and so on. So conveying those facts can change perceptions, and it's incumbent on leadership to do that. Thank you.
Very good point. Thank you, Suzanne. The lady in the blue scarf, who is going to introduce herself, so I won't have to call her the lady in the blue scarf any longer.
Well, actually, that sounds quite nice. My name is Evelyn Brodkin. I'm a professor at the University of Chicago, and I've actually just returned from doing some on-the-ground research in Sweden and Denmark on the response to the refugee crisis. So I very much appreciated your comments about how we have to move to a more granular level and to a local level in order to more fully understand what's going on. And with that in mind, I wondered if I could get the representative to comment on what you see as the challenges in working at the state level to get responses in some meaningful way at the local level, including the municipalities and the vast number of NGOs and grassroots organizations that are playing really important roles in this as this plays out. Thank you.
It's a difficult to have an answer in this. If you see what people want and what they express, you can see that after we took this new proposal for a new legislation in Sweden that put down the level, the asylum in the asylum legislation to a minimal level according to the EU, we can see that around 65-70% of the population thinks that was a good decision. At the same time, you can see quite a lot of people think you should go further than this, and then we have some that think that we should stay at a more generous level, some kind. So I think what we've been talking here before, showing leadership is very important to show that there is a way forward, to show what is the aim in the long run, and we can manage the situation will make people comfortable to believe that, well, it's okay to take refugees and to give them a home, and it's good for development in the country also. But I think it's hard for us. The difficult thing is it's hard for us to reach out to those people who are very negative against the migration. We really don't reach them because they have a network of their own. You can see at the internet, they don't look at the newspapers. They only look at some, I don't know what to call it in English, but some black sites where they're just chatting with each other and put forward facts that are really crazy. So this is really difficult for us to reach out to them, but to the majority, I think that we can persuade them to see the benefits by migration if we can at the same time show that we manage it, and they feel comfortable with that the system in Sweden won't fail in any way. I don't know if I answered your question, but.
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and I do think that one of the things we see with refugees and with other migrants in surveys and other kinds of research data is that familiarity breeds content. Yeah, I just thought of that. Good. Huh? You ask, people who actually know refugees and interact with migrants tend to have, it's not universal, but tend to have more positive experiences than those who, live in rural, homogeneous communities who have not interacted with migrants. And when you look at, the great global cities, Toronto with 52% of its population foreign-born. I don't know what it is in Chicago. I'm sure you do. New York, London, Stockholm. The places where there is a real intermingling of people tend to be the most positive about immigration, and I think it's because they do see it working. Places where I gave a speech in Hamburg recently, and Hamburg has received quite a lot of refugees in the distribution of people around Germany, and I asked the audience of maybe 200 people, how many of you know a refugee? How many of you have met a refugee? And there were maybe 2 or 3 hands that went up in that crowd, and I thought that was worrying. That if you don't know the people, if you can't identify with them, it makes people become easier prey to the fears and so on. So I think there's a great deal to do at the municipal level, at the civil society level, and we see a fair amount in this country in the sort of welcoming communities movement with civic groups and churches and schools and colleges and so on. That's really where it works, in my opinion. And if I have a criticism of some of the European states, is that they expect the state to do too much and leave too much to the state, whereas it's really at that ground level that hearts and minds are changed, in my opinion. Please.
Hey, you're exactly right. That's exactly what we see across America. We like to say, part of my job is managing our resettlement effort in the U.S., and we like to say that everyone that's met one of our refugees likes refugees, and it's almost 90% true. It's really amazing. And in one small area of disagreement, even in very homogeneous rural towns, if you put a refugee family there, everybody likes them.
Well, that was my point.
Oh,
You know,
okay.
it's
So-
the people who
yeah.
haven't met them.
So it doesn't have to be a Toronto or Munich. We in fact, because of a number of reasons, tend to put our resettled refugees in small cities and towns across America, and they're in general welcome. That I would just add that we resettled working with 9 NGOs, and the NGOs report to us that the grassroots reaction to some of the state-level refugee conversations that have been going on has been an increase in volunteers to help refugees. So we have this funny phenomenon where at some levels of the federal level, especially in last fall's primary and winter's primaries, and some states, the dialogue about refugees have been very negative, but the reaction to that in cities and towns has been an upswing of support for refugees. And that's just to emphasize what Kathleen said. That's where the rubber meets the road. That's where it's really important to work with refugees and work with communities. And that's where we get our best results.
I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions or comments. Please.
My name is Wes Knowles, and I'm a student at Roanoke College. When we talk about global migration management systems, one thing that to me is concerning is the subsidiary protection. You see this a lot in Europe, and it seems like that there's always this 1-year contract that's sort of issued out to asylum seekers, and they live on this 1-year schedule, and they have to go and they have to reapply every single year for another protection, and that makes it very difficult to integrate. It makes it very difficult for them to get further jobs and educations. But I think that we have to start thinking about some of the more granular level stuff, because I don't think this has been captured in a lot of the summits that we're seeing right now. Is that sort of the more in the weeds kind of policy details are just going unnoticed.
That's a very interesting point, and I think it is applicable in a lot of places. I don't know if Sweden is one of them, or if you'd like to comment on that, Lars. Or I've just been working on a paper on Turkey this morning, very early this morning, and looking through the law, there were like 5 or 6 different statuses, all of which are temporary, except for people who are refugees as a result of events occurring in Europe, and I think there are fewer than 5 in all of Turkey. So the millions are in these temporary situations, and it does create a lot of uncertainty. Any thoughts?
Well, I just can shortly say that Sweden has had permanent residency for a long time of years beyond. Now we soon will have a new legislation there it comes to temporary protection, which will last for 3 years concerning the large amount of people coming to Sweden. But I agree, it's better to have permanent residentship. It's make it more probably better for the people who come here and that have a residency to get work and feel safe in many ways.
I think one additional wrinkle on your observation there is the very long waiting periods that people endure before they have a final determination on their asylum applications. That creates an even higher level of anxiety and uncertainty. Simon?
No, that's what I was going to say.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. Your point is very good. It's important to get people permanently legalized as soon as possible so that they can integrate. I think we do that very well with our resettlement program. People can work as soon as they arrive. They get a green card within a year. They can become a citizen within 4 more years after that. Asylum, once you have asylum, I'm not an asylum expert, but I think you have full employment rights. But as Kathleen pointed, there's a long waiting period to get there, just due to the number of requests. And then we have things like temporary protective status, which needs to be renewed every 18 months per country. We have people in deferred action. and then we have a large number of undocumented people. So for them, the situation is difficult. But I think, as you know, at least in the U.S., because of the political polarization on this issue, we've been able to come to an agreement on how to move forward.
Thanks for raising that question. Very good point. If there are no other questions, would either of you like to make any closing comments, wrap up?
Just to thank the hosts again, and thank all of you for coming out, and looking forward at us instead of the beautiful view out there. I just to emphasize, I think that we have very good regulations in the world today on refugees, but in the world of migrants, there are many, many different types of people many different categories of migrants are sort of all thrown into one group, and a lot more, I think, has to be done to find legal paths for them to enter, to find better treatment for them, and to give them other options in their home countries if we want to tackle this problem. And don't forget, when you look at this, to look at south-south migration and not just south-north migration.
Any closing thoughts, Lars?
Yes, I also want to thank you all for coming here and ask these intelligent questions and comments to us. And as you probably heard, we agree to the most of what we said here. And this is a very interesting question about migration, and it's a question that we have to address and talk about a lot in the future. So I want to really thank the host also for making this seminar possible. Thank you.
Thanks to all of you for joining us.